Hello, my wonderful third graders. I hope you are having a fantastic day. We are still in our Native Americans, Regions, and Cultures unit. This is Lesson 6, Native Americans of the Northeast. Last time we did the Southwest, and now we are in the Northeast. Some vocabulary words you will hear throughout the read aloud. Cloaked is a verb, means covered, hid, concealed. Molly cloaked herself in a blanket and hid under it during a game of hide and seek. A longhouse is an Iroquois house made of wood and inhabited by various members of the clan related to one another through the mother's side of the family. A peace pipe is a sacred pipe that was smoked as a ritual when tribes would negotiate war and peace. The sachems are chiefs representing tribes at an Iroquois tribal or league council. The Iroquois sachem were always men, but the women chose the sachems. That's interesting. Scarce is an adjective, it's a descriptive word. It means not enough to satisfy the need or demand for something. Water is frequently scarce in a desert region. Shamans are people who are regarded as having access to spirits and are said to use magic to cure illness, tell the future, and control the spirits. A wampum is a beaded belt and necklaces made from shells that the Iroquois used as currency during trade and to tell a story. A wigwam is a dwelling of the eastern woodland Native Americans, which had a pole framework covered with mats, bark, or hides, and was either cone or dome-shaped. The journey for some native peoples took them to the northeastern part of America, to the abundant leafy woodlands and deep dark forests that stretched from Canada and the Great Lakes south to the Carolinas, and from the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast west to the Mississippi River. This was a time long before Europeans came and made their mark upon the land. This was a time when some native peoples made the forest their home and lived in long-term balance with their environment. Unlike in the Southwest, rain fell, as it still does, more frequently upon most of this land. The native peoples of this region did not believe there was a need to call upon the assistance of gods for rain to soak the earth and make the crops grow. And just as today in the region of the eastern woodlands, each season brought with it a different climate and a changing earth. The same freshwater rivers and lakes, the same imposing mountains and forests color the landscape today as they did back then. As you have already learned, some of the earliest people to settle across this region were the mound builders, whose cultures lasted for thousands of years. They spread out from the Mississippi River and lived on the surrounding land, hunting in the forests and utilizing the abundant natural resources available to them. The people who settled in this area are known as the Eastern Woodland Indians. After hundreds of years of nomadic existence, other groups of people, bound by family connections, formed themselves into tribes. In fact, the Eastern Woodland Indians were made up of numerous tribes. Some of these tribes included the Iroquois, Mohegans, and Powhatans. Over time, these tribes established their own cultural identities, which included a range of languages spoken throughout this large area. The Eastern Woodland Indians often interacted with each other. Sometimes their interactions were peaceful, at other times they were not. These tribes relied on the land for their very existence. Why do you think food was scarce during this mini ice age? Remember, we're still part of a mini ice age. It's more difficult to grow crops when the temperature is much colder, especially if the ground freezes. With less vegetation, there might also have been a shortage of animals to hunt, because they too would have had less food to eat. They guarded their villages, their hunting lands, their crops, and their settlements from invasion by neighboring tribes. Some scientists believe that wars may have been the result of an era around 500 to 1,000 years ago when the climate changed considerably. A harsh mini ice age swept across the world. This occurred thousands and thousands of years after the Beringa crossing. During this time, when food was scarce and it was difficult to survive, tribal wars broke out and brought about the deaths of many young warriors and the destruction of tribal villages. Finally, in search of peace, these tribes joined together to form the Iroquois Nation, also called the Iroquois Confederacy. As they negotiated or discussed how they would live peacefully together, they often smoked a peace pipe. As you have heard, the Iroquois did not call themselves by this name. They called themselves Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. The Iroquois people were actually 5 separate choices: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and the Cayuga, that inhabited a particular part of the eastern woodland region. They lived largely in what is now New York and Ohio. It's pretty close to where we live. Once a year, sachems, or chiefs from each of the tribes, who were always men but always chosen by women, would meet in a council to make new laws and deal with any new problems that arose. As with all native peoples, the landscape helped shape the Iroquois culture. It greatly influenced what kinds of houses they built, what clothes they wore, what food they ate, how they traveled, what weapons they had, what tools they used, what gods they worshipped, and even what language they spoke. A typical home for many eastern woodland Indians depended more on climate and available resources than anything else. The 3 most familiar kinds of homes across the northeast region were the longhouse, the wigwam, and a round-roofed clay and pole structure. Because the winter months were generally cold, with deep snow covering much of the ground, many eastern woodland Indians, including the Iroquois, constructed wigwams and longhouses. Wigwams were rounded structures that looked similar to wooden igloos and were homes in which individual families lived. The longhouse and the wigwam were made almost entirely from wood. In the colder regions of the north, especially around the Great Lakes, native peoples constructed wigwams that could be easily dismantled so that the tribes could, for part of the year, live a nomadic life. That's cool. They could take their houses apart and travel with them. Convenient. During this time of the year, they followed the herds they hunted for their survival. To build a wigwam, young trees were cut down and bent over to form a rounded frame. Tree bark was placed over the frame. Grasses were then added to help insulate the home. Insulate means to keep the heat in. A small hole in the roof allowed smoke from the fire inside the home to escape. The family cooked their food on an open fire and slept on mats. In the wintertime, they used animal furs to keep themselves warm. Longhouses were much larger than wigwams and were home to several families that were related to each other. The Iroquois considered themselves to be related to each other through the mothers in the tribe. This extended family group was called a clan. Each clan had an animal name. When a young couple married, they went to live with the bride's family. Some longhouses ranged in size from 50 feet to 100 feet long and housed as many as 50 people. It's a big house. To construct a longhouse, once again a frame was made using young trees. Bark was placed over the frame and was then sewn together. The longhouse had a large central hallway with rooms on either side. The family members slept on sleeping platforms. Some Iroquois still build longhouses today for ceremonies. Just like other tribes, the Iroquois made baskets and pots in which to store food. In some ways, an eastern woodlands longhouse would have been similar to a Viking longhouse with a large extended family living inside it. Because of a history of tribal war, the Iroquois built long walls all around their villages for safety. There could be several walls, but there was only one entranceway, and that could be swiftly sealed shut if needed. The Iroquois grew different varieties of corn and beans. They also grew squash, sunflowers, and tobacco. They cleared the land of trees and shrubs and planted their crops. Corn, beans, and squash were particularly important crops, and the Iroquois referred to them as the Three Sisters. Corn, beans, and squash. Corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters. Like members of a family, the three plants helped each other grow. By planting these three plants together, the Iroquois relied on the natural relationship among these plants. The corn stalks provided a support for the bean plants, which would wind around the corn stalks. The squash leaves that lay on the ground prevented weeds and increased the amount of rainwater that was absorbed into the soil. Also, the bean plants produced a natural bacteria that made the soil more fertile for the corn and squash plants. Well, maybe I should try that in my garden this summer. Maybe I'll grow corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters. Tobacco was smoked as part of ceremonial rituals and when promises were being made between tribes. The Iroquois and many other native people believed that the smoke carried prayers and promises up to the gods. Tobacco was also used to dress wounds and to relieve toothaches. Who can tell me the name of the object that was used for smoking during these rituals? The peace pipe. In the winter time, when food was scarce, many Iroquois left their villages to hunt. They moved with the herds and often did not return to their villages until early spring. The Iroquois hunted deer, using bows and arrows. Young boys cloaked themselves in deerskin as they stealthily crept through the forest in pursuit of their prey. They also hunted smaller mammals, setting traps to catch them. In addition, the Iroquois fished and gathered berries and tapped the trees to get maple syrup. Yes, the Iroquois had a sweet tooth, too. Like many other tribes, the Iroquois lived near water. Water was a source of life, and it provided a means of transportation. The Iroquois traveled in dugout canoes. They fished using nets and traps. Depending on the weather, the Iroquois wore a range of clothing. In the summer, the men wore a breechcloth, which was a short piece of buckskin. Women wore dresses made of grass fibers. In the wintertime, everyone relied on animal fur to keep warm. Men also wore buckskin moccasins on their feet. They used dyes, beads, and quills to decorate their clothes as well as their skin. Where did the materials come from that were used to make the Iroquois clothes and other possessions? They used their environment and the animals they hunted. Very important to the Iroquois was something called wampums. Wampum was an artistic way of communicating important thoughts and decisions. Wampum was belts and necklaces made from colored shells. The color and design of the beads could tell a story, or they could be a symbolic means of communication. Wampum could also be used when trading. It was therefore a kind of currency or money. Wampum was considered to be very valuable and was an important part of Iroquois culture. The Iroquois, like many other eastern woodland Indians, believed in a spirit world that was governed by the Great Spirit. For the Iroquois, that Great Spirit was called Orinda. They also believed in an evil spirit, too. The Iroquois believed that everything had a spirit and that all living things on the earth were connected. They believed that it was their responsibility to care for the earth. Each season brought with it special Iroquois ceremonies. The Iroquois had shamans, or holy men. It was believed that shamans could communicate with the spirit world. Shamans were thought to have special powers to do such things as cure the sick, bring about a good harvest, or bring victory to a tribe going to war. And so the Iroquois, as well as other eastern woodland Indians, lived out their lives in this way. They told stories and celebrated their history. They worshipped the Great Spirit, and they lived in harmony with the land and all living creatures. Today, many Iroquois continue to follow and honor their traditional ways. Amazingly, some still build longhouses for ceremonies, and their leaders meet to guard and protect their ancient culture. As with the Hopi, some Iroquois have also developed a mix of modern and traditional culture ways, as you can see in the images. How did the Iroquois adapt to their environment? They built 3 types of dwellings: longhouses, wigwams, and round-roofed clay and pole structures. They wore warm clothing made of animal skin in the winter. Name 3 tribes of the eastern woodland Indians. The Iroquois, Mohawk, and Powhatan. The Iroquois people were actually made up of 5 different tribes. These tribes are the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and the Cayuga. Why was the Iroquois Nation formed? The Iroquois Nation was formed in an attempt to prevent conflict among the 5 tribes. What role did this sachem play in the Iroquois Nation? What did the sachem do? The sachem was a representative of the tribe to the annual meeting, where the nation would create new laws or solve any problems that came up. What crops were referred to as the 3 sisters? Corn, beans, and squash. Why were they called this? They grew very close together, providing natural benefits to the other plants in the group, and they were very important to the Iroquois people. During the cold winter months, when food was scarce, you heard that the people of this region lived a nomadic life following herds of animals. What do you think were some of the challenges people faced when they moved from place to place? It would have been challenging to have to frequently dismantle and rebuild their homes. If there was snow, it would have been especially difficult to travel on foot. Packing, organizing, and transporting all their possessions would have required a great deal of effort and organization. Young children, the elderly, and the sick would have found moving from place to place quite difficult. What were some of the Iroquois religious beliefs? They believed in nature spirits. Their great spirit was called Orinda. They believed that shamans could communicate with the spirit world, cure the sick, bring about a good harvest, or achieve victory in war. From your point of view, is the wampum, which was used by the Iroquois long ago, like cash? Is it like cash that we use today? What do you think? Are they similar? Are they different? Support your answer. What do you think? What do you think were some of the advantages and disadvantages of living in a longhouse? People probably worked together and shared all of the chores related to looking after the longhouse. They would have shared the care of the children and of the elderly. They would have shared their food and possessions with each other. They might have felt cramped living in the longhouse together with little privacy. Because of the pressure of living so close together, there may have been some conflicts. Yeah, they probably had people fighting, not getting along, and also maybe sometimes getting along. Our word for today is cloaked. In the read aloud you heard, young boys cloaked themselves in deerskin as they stealthily crept through the forest in pursuit of their prey. Say the word cloaked. Cloaked means covered, hid, or concealed. Little Red Riding Hood cloaked herself in a red cape and traveled through the forest to her grandmother's house. Have you ever cloaked yourself or someone in something? Where were you and what was it? Be sure to use the word cloak when you tell about it. Cloaked when you tell about it. What part of speech is the word cloaked? Is it a noun, an adjective, an adverb, a verb? Good job, third graders. I hope you enjoyed learning more about the Iroquois.